Hello, and welcome to the first episode of the Libertarian Manifesto. There's a couple of things that I'd like to talk to you about this week. One of them would be the Marines and the controversial YouTube video that came out of Marines urinating on some dead Taliban soldiers. The other thing I'd like to talk about is Ron Paul and his foreign policy, and also how Ron Paul is really the only anti-establishment candidate. I'd also like to touch on the war with Iran again. I've touched on this in the past, but I'd like to touch on that one more time. And also I'd like to touch on the illusions of a two-party system. And so to go ahead and get started, let's start with the Marine video. It hit all the major news stations. You see these Marines that are urinating on dead bodies, and a lot of people have trouble processing how people can do something like that. And as a former Marine, and being that I was in the infantry, I think that I have a good idea of how these things come about. And the other thing is, I hear a lot of judgment of these people, of these Marines, and I fear that our government is going to make them a scapegoat, and going to look to make an example of these young patriots, and they're going to end up ruining the lives of these brave young men, and I think that's a tragedy. So let's start with a little bit about combat. Combat's a horrific thing. I'm the son of a combat veteran. I'm a veteran myself. I served my country in the Marine Corps Infantry during the first Gulf War. My father spent 2.5 years in the jungles of Southeast Asia, and was wounded 3 times before he got bounced out of country. My grandfather was a combat veteran. Both my uncles, all 3 of my uncles actually, are combat veterans, and my father-in-law is a combat veteran, and the list goes on and on. My family basically served in every war since, going all the way back to the Revolution, and I got to imagine what the kind of people we are. We've been in war for a long, long time. So this is something that isn't really new to my family, and I was certainly raised, it was a very, my father raised me in a way where, I was taught to believe that it was always possible that I could end up going to war. And certainly when I signed up to the Marine Corps Infantry, that wasn't, I didn't think that there was never a chance that I would go to war. As it turned out, I had orders to go to war, and they were canceled before I ended up getting there. The war ended before I got my time in there. So I trained for war, and that training is very stressful, and I think I have a good understanding of what these guys go through. And when we place them in foreign countries and ask them to go to war, the combat is a horrific thing. It has an effect on the mind. It's incredibly stressful, and the problem is a lot of times every time when you're in combat, you have split seconds to make decisions that are life-threatening decisions, and the people in the rear with the gear, as we used to say, they have every bit of time, leisure, and the ability to judge the decisions that you made when your life was on the line and the life of your brothers was on the line. Now, in this case, you have some dead enemy combatants, and you have 4 Marines standing around pissing on these men. Now, that is not necessarily what we want to see from our soldiers and Marines, but at the same time, when you're in combat and these men that you're fighting against have killed your brothers, They've acted in cowardly ways. They've planted IEDs. They won't face you head to head in a military action. Instead, they dress as civilians, they hide behind civilians, and this is the nature of guerrilla war, and it's a very ugly thing. A lot of people don't understand the impact that this has on the mind of the men that are fighting. And, one of the things in combat is you grow to sometimes hate and despise your enemy because of the impact that he's had on your life. You may have been wounded, you may have had your friends wounded, your friends may have been killed, your friends may have been maimed permanently for life. And so you're not very fond of the people you're fighting, and especially in a guerrilla war, because it's more difficult because your enemy doesn't have a uniform. You run around in uniform and you're an obvious target. Your enemy, he has the luxury of not doing that and hiding. And hiding amongst civilians. And in the military we consider that a cowardly act. And I understand history and I understand the nature of warfare, so I understand why our enemies do this. They know that they cannot face us in a head-to-head battle. They're not about large-scale confrontation. That's the nature of guerrilla war. So at some point it has an impact on your mind where these people become dehumanized, and you certainly grow to hate these people who have killed your brothers, who have maimed your brothers, who have injured you and put you through all of this undue stress. So before I would judge these people, I would just ask that you run down and sign up. And you get a rifle in your hand, and you volunteer to go into the infantry, in an Army outfit, in a Marine Corps outfit, whatever the case. If you want to judge these people, then take a walk in their shoes and see what that's like, and see at the end of the day how you come out of that, and before you make any judgments. This comes back to foreign policy. I have a lot of issues with the war in Afghanistan. I certainly supported it in the beginning, but I think our country lost focus of the mission. Unfortunately, we had a chance to kill Osama bin Laden in the first 6 months of the war. We had him in the Tora Bora Mountains, and the Delta Force had been raining lead on his head for 3 days straight. And he was on the radio, and he was crying. He was crying to his men. He was apologizing for getting them into this scenario. And the Delta Force had reached out to the powers that be and asked for 1,000 Rangers to cover the backside of that mountain. And because they knew his only escape route was into Pakistan. And unfortunately, the Bush administration turned him down. Made him go with local fighters, and the local fighters were of course sponsored by corrupt warlords that were more about getting the duffel bags full of cash that the CIA was flying into them than they were about actually killing Osama bin Laden, who was a hero in the area because of the humanitarian works that he had did for the local people. I mean, he knew how to win over the hearts and minds of these people. So that's one of the things that people like him do. They buy off the local people, they get their support, and then they have a way to hide in that region. So we could have taken care of this war within the first 6 months had the Bush administration not blown the request from the Delta Force and the CIA off, and if they didn't make them go with warlords, if they would have given them what they asked for, we could have killed this guy in the first 6 months, packed our gear up, and got the hell out. Why am I bringing that up in this particular scenario? Because I think it's unfortunate that we've kept our men there for, damn near 10 years. Actually, maybe a little bit over 10 years now. And we've got this illusion that, that everything is okay. And that this war is just, we've got to stay over there, we've got to help this nation build. Well, As a member of the Marine Corps Infantry, I was never trained to build nations. I was trained on how to kill people. I was trained on how to blow things up, how to use explosives, how to use fire maneuver techniques, how to use a lot of different firearms, things of this nature. My MOS was 0311, which is a rifleman, and that is what I specialized in. And I know, you know, what these guys are trained to do, and I can tell you firsthand that it's not to build nations. Now, with this case, with these young Marines urinating on the bodies of dead Taliban fighters, my primary concern is that we're going to ruin the lives of 4 patriots, 4 people that signed up to give their lives to this country. And everybody likes to run around and wave the flag and be pro-war, but when the ugliness of war brings out the truth and what war is about, then all of a sudden we think that we should prosecute these young men, and we think that, you know, we should ruin the lives of these young men to make an example of them. And I think that is the greatest tragedy of all. So before you pass judgment, or if you feel like passing judgment, just go down to your local recruiter's office and sign up and offer to go into the Marine Corps Infantry or the Army Infantry, and that way you'll have a first-hand account. I personally would like to see these guys with a minor slap on the wrist, non-judicial punishment, something that says, hey, we know you made a mistake, and especially putting it on video. But I do not want to see these guys' careers ruined. I do not want to see them bounced out of the military. I do not want to see them get a bad conduct or a dishonorable discharge. These men put their lives on the line every day for the people next to them. They're not fighting for this larger idea of America or spreading democracy over there. They're hung up in the reality. How can me and my brothers stay alive today is what they're thinking. So if you want to be patriotic and contact your congressman and make sure that they know that you don't want to see these people's lives ruined over what I consider to be a small mistake. I personally, I don't think it's the greatest thing in the world, obviously, to be urinating on dead soldiers, but I recognize the horror of combat and what it does, and I withhold my judgment against these men, and I say, hey, we've put them in a bad position to begin with. They're young men, and war is a horrible thing, and I chalk that up to a casualty of war. So that's what I have to say about that. You know, there's a couple other things I did want to touch on today. I wanted to talk a little bit about Ron Paul's foreign policy. You know, I talk to liberals and conservatives, and I hear that, you know, whenever I talk about a non-interventionist policy, what I get back is we can't withdraw from the world community. And, you know, I think that's an interesting counterline to something that, you know, that really they're apples and oranges. One has nothing to do with the other. We have somewhere around 139 military bases around the world. You know, and these are sometimes in areas where the local people don't want us there, and it creates a lot of tension. Certainly this was the scenario in the Philippines. My father had been there, and in the Philippines they'd been fighting guerrilla wars with local groups, militant groups, for the past 100 years. And a lot of people didn't know that. You know, my troop leaders in the School of Infantry had all had rounds fired at them over in the Philippines. And, you know, and so you think about that. You think, oh, these guys are just in the Philippines. That's not a war zone. Well, certainly for the Marine Corps Infantry, we had a different idea about that. And it was a war zone. It just wasn't broadcast over here. And nobody really knew about it outside of the military community. So these 139 military bases around the world, another issue I have, you know, so you have the impact let me take a step back for a minute. You have the impact on these local populations. I talked a little bit about the Philippines. In Okinawa, there's certainly there wasn't the the shots or rounds coming down range at Marines, but there certainly was a lot of tension between the Marines and the Navy and the local populations there. The local populations were not too appreciative to have us there. We had helicopters crash that killed their children in schools, and we had planes crash that killed their children in schools. We had, with any, when you put any group of people there, there's going to be a certain amount of crime. So you had American soldiers committing crimes against the local populations, and there were cases I remember of Marines raping young girls and things like that. And, I understand that that's a very small minority. I know that the vast majority of U.S. servicemen and women are very honorable people. They're patriots, and they would never do anything against these local people. But these small groups that have and that have committed crimes of this nature have been have incited hatred in the local communities, and so there's an impact on these local communities, and that's why we got out of places like Scuba Bay in the Philippines, and that's why right now there's a lot of pressure to get out of Okinawa for the Marines, and we're moving from Okinawa, and now we're going to Guam, and the people of Guam aren't really too happy where the military base is being built there. So there is an impact on these local populations, and I guess my one question would be, why? Why do you have to have all these military bases around the world? We certainly have a lot of interests around the world, and I'm not opposed to trade, to free trade with these nations, but I don't want to put military bases where people don't want them, and where the local people, the government may want them because it brings in money, it brings in resources, but the people themselves don't want it. And that creates a scenario where, Americans are hated, and you can downplay that all you want, but you can downplay it at your peril, because the bottom line is a lot of these populations where these bases are at aren't too happy with having American servicemen and women there, and they would like their sovereign land to be their sovereign land. And if you think about it in that respect, would you accept anybody having a military base here in our country? I wouldn't. I served in the military. If there was a foreign country in our sovereign continental United States with a military base, I would damn near consider that an act of war. And so that's how I feel. There's a couple of other things. We've got these 130 some military bases around the world, and we currently borrow 40% of our annual budget every year. And so if we're spending 40% more than we make, how can we afford to have 139 military bases around the world? Well, the answer is we can't. We're living beyond our means. So if you take the just the financial aspect of it, it clearly is something that we can't afford to support. And that's why, withdrawing from these areas doesn't have to be seen as an isolationist type of policy. It should really be seen as just being fiscally conservative and being honest with the American people that we don't have the money to do this. And with our current economic system, we've got a debt that's almost $16 trillion. Americans need to wake up and understand that. Now, you look at some of the other aspects of Ron Paul's foreign policy, and he talks about cutting all foreign aid. I think in April, President Obama came out and said, well, foreign aid's only 1% of the annual budget. Well, it's around 1.5, so I'm not gonna, hold. I'm not gonna say President Obama's lying. I don't think he's lying about that, but he downplays that. Well, that number comes out to $44.1 billion. So even though it's only 1 to 1.5% of the annual budget, $44.1 billion, and that was as of 2009, is a very significant number to me. And I would rather see that type of money go to rebuild the infrastructure in my country as opposed to going to support our quote unquote interests around the world. I don't think it supports our interests, and quite honestly, I think a lot of it ends up going to military aid, to corrupt governments, and then these governments oppress the local people, and then the people know that their governments are puppets to America, and it ends up creating more hatred. And so when we look at why there are countries around the world that dislike Americans, it's time that we get honest with ourselves, and we say, what are we doing in some of these parts of the world that incite this type of hatred? You know, in the Middle East, we've had bases in Saudi Arabia, and I certainly in the past was probably a neocon, and very conservative, especially in the matters of war and fiscal policy. Never so much on the social end, but that's neither here nor there. Um, you know, we've got bases in the Holy Land for Muslims. And a lot of Americans downplay that, and they go, well, the liberals think that people hate us because we're over in that part of the world, and that's not it. These people would hate us regardless of what they did, what we did. They hate us because they hate liberty, they hate the American way of life, and they hate freedom. That may sound real pleasing to conservative ears, but you really, if you believe that, you need to read a lot more. You need to look into our history of intervention in the Middle East. The reason people that do hate us over there, they hate us because of our policies and our history of intervention. You know, there's numerous examples of this. You can start with the Shah of Iran. In the 50s, the CIA led a coup that overthrew a democratically elected government. We put in our guy, who was the Shah of Iran, and he had a brutally oppressive government there for years until he was overthrown by the Islamic Revolution in 1979. Now, look, I'm not a guy that wants to say, I'm not a guy that's going to say we can do things that are going to stop everybody from hating us. I don't believe that. I don't believe if we play nice with the entire world that everybody's going to stop hating us. But I do believe that we're going to give the vast majority of people a lot less reasons to hate us if we would stop these interventionist foreign policies. Imperialistic practices like this don't do anything to endear you to the local populations of these countries around the world. And so we as Americans, we have to be honest, and we have to stop thinking that it's just these religious lunatics who want to blow us up regardless of what we do. You can look back. I remember you can look back to the Mujahideen and the freedom fighters of Afghanistan. When I was a child, I would read Soldier of Fortune magazine when I was 12 years old, and I remember in the back of Soldier of Fortune magazine in the early 80s, there was always ads to support the Afghan freedom fighters, and you could send money to these CIA fronts. You could donate money, and this money would go to the CIA. The CIA would then use these funds to train local indigenous populations. The Mujahideen in Afghanistan would train them to commit terrorist acts against the Soviets. And so we had the goal of handing the Soviets their Vietnam. That was the goal of the CIA. And oddly enough, it was one of the few successes that the CIA has had in its entire history. But I think that had more to do with the commitment of the Mujahideen and the Afghani people. These people had rejected centralized governments that came in and tried to take them over for 5,000 years. And we trained them in acts of terrorism. And we gave them Stinger missiles, and they started shooting, the Russian Hind helicopters out of the sky like it was nobody's business. And all of a sudden the Russians realized, when you've got a people with this type of commitment and this type of terrain that have been this way for thousands of years, there's no winning. And so the Russians eventually became pragmatic and withdrawn. Now, I'm not pro-Russian, okay? That's not the thing. I'm simply stating what happened in history. And so you realize that our intervention there trained these people, we paid these people, we gave these people weapons. And now these same people, some of them, have certainly turned these weapons against us and are now using, our training that we provided them to train other people to kill American soldiers. So we have a history of intervention that has created a lot of the hatred. It's time for Americans to wake up, and it's time for them to stop saying these cute little slogans like, oh, the people there are religious lunatics that will hate us regardless of what we do. There certainly is going to be a small population that's going to hate you regardless of what you do. But as far as the masses in almost any of these countries don't subscribe to that type of ideology. A lot of these people are no different than you and I, in that they just want their kids to be able to live a peaceful life, and they want to be able to provide for their family. So, and you look back to Iran again, we armed Saddam Hussein for years to fight Iran and to start a war with Iran, because it goes along with the theory of an enemy of my enemy is a friend of mine type of thing. So we have a history of intervention that has caused a lot of this, and if we would pull back and stop intervening in these foreign government affairs, we would probably find that a lot less people hated us in the world. And so when people say that it's not our actions, it's nothing we've done, I think that that's almost sticking your head in the sand approach, and it's not really looking at a historical aspect of what we've done in these countries and around the world as far as our imperialistic policies. And that's why I advocate what Ron Paul advocates, and that's pulling out of these countries and conducting free trade with these countries. It doesn't have to be isolationist. Just because we're pulling back our troops to our country to protect our borders and to protect our nation doesn't mean we have to withdraw from the world community. Okay? What that means is that we're not going to put our people at risk, okay, abroad. We're not going to spend money we don't have. We would no longer support foreign and corrupt governments that oppress their people. And we would, if we do all of these things, it doesn't make us isolationists. It makes us good stewards of freedom throughout the world. It allows us to lead by example, and for a change to really hold the American ideals in a higher place and lead the world by example. It's not withdrawing from the world community. So don't buy into that, and when people present that argument to you, just tell them, the reality is we have a history of intervention, and not just intervention in the Middle East. The CIA has a wonderful track record in South America too, so that's a little bit on foreign policy. I don't think withdrawing from these bases around the world and pulling our troops back and protecting our interests here at home is an isolationist policy. I think it's a good foreign policy, and I think it would put us in a stronger position and make our country stronger going forward. Okay, now, I've talked a little bit in the past about war with Iran. You know, we've got this nuclear threat from Iran, or at least that's what the government is telling us, and certainly their cheerleaders in the media are doing everything they can to sell this war with Iran. In the past 100 years, I don't know that Iran has directly attacked any of its neighbors, number one. So, but Iran has been attacked by its neighbors. and some of its neighbors have been supported by us, Saddam Hussein, in attacking Iran and starting a war with them. Again, this comes back to foreign policy and a history of intervention. I saw an infographic on Facebook one day that showed all of the military bases around Iran, the U.S. military bases, and it said who should really be afraid of who. And I thought that was a very eye-opening thing for Americans to see. I think that more Americans need to see things like that so they realize we are surrounding their country in reality. I haven't lost one bit of sleep worrying about Iran striking my country, to be honest with you. And it's not because I'm some peacenik or some liberal. It's just that I'm a realist, and you know, I look at the reality. If Iran did deliver or did have a nuclear weapon, how would they deliver it here? You know, these things. One, uranium's not easy to enrich. Two, you've got to have a delivery vehicle for it. And three, to make you know, the suitcase-sized dirty bombs is a lot more complex from a scientific and physics aspect than a lot of people know. You know, I hear from liberals and conservatives alike, it seems that they've been sold already, this war with Iran, and that scares me. You know, we're worried about them closing down the Straits of Hormuz. We hear these statements like, well, Iran wants to wipe Israel off the map. Well, that's not necessarily true. Granted, you know, there are a small population in Iran, the leaders, the religious leaders, a very even small population of them that are religious lunatics. The vast majority of the people of Iran, one, are young. Most of them, I think it's something like 67% are under the age of 40. And they happen to be very pro-Western, okay? And so one of the things that we could do to turn all of these pro-Western people against us is to go ahead and start a war with Iran. You know, and this is how we get ourselves into trouble. And people say, well, what are you going to do about Iran getting a nuclear bomb? And I said, well, you know, a couple of things on that. One, Iran is surrounded by people with nuclear weapons. Pakistan's got nuclear weapons. Israel's got, you know, somewhere around 300 nuclear weapons. There is a lot of people in that theater that have nuclear weapons. Now, I'm not for nuclear proliferation, and I think that there are ways that we could more intelligently interact if we wanted to take away nuclear capabilities from Iran. One of the ways we've already done, a little virus we wrote with the Israeli intelligence, we wrote a little virus called Stuxnet. That's S-T-U-X-N-E-T. You know, this is a virus we put out that went in, essentially was malware, and went in and destroyed some of the Siemens equipment in the facility that they had where they were trying to, you know, enrich uranium. The other thing that you need to know is that enriching uranium is not an easy thing. You know, for a nuclear weapon, for weapons grade uranium, you need something like 90%, you know, pure uranium, and to enrich to like 90% level. And you know, right now, Iran, a lot of people have estimated that they were somewhere around 20% before the Stuxnet thing hit. And you know, I don't have a problem with necessarily deploying viruses like that. I think it's a lot more intelligent than the military intervention For one thing, we can't afford to go to war with Iran. Two, I think that people in that theater, if they're afraid, including the Israelis, that's something that they need to address. Now, speaking of the Israelis, they apparently are addressing it, and I think it was maybe a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, where the Mossad had attached a bomb to a nuclear scientist's car, blew him up and killed him. And then I think that guy was on his way to a funeral for another Iranian nuclear scientist. If anybody else did this, it would be an act of terrorism. That's the reality. If anybody blows up something in another country, that would be an act of terrorism. But the Israelis did it, and the Israelis, if they perceive that as a threat, I understand them doing that. I don't believe that Iran's leadership is a bunch of wonderful people that are really nice, and if we're just nice to them, they'll be nice back to us. I don't believe any of that. But at the same time, I believe that they have a lot more to fear from us than we do of them. And history tells me that I'm right. We have a history of intervention in their politics. We have a history of intervention of coups in their country. Iran's never led a coup against this country. Okay, so before you say we can't just play nice and we can't just play nice and everybody's going to love us, you can't make that as an absolute statement. You have to understand history and our interactions with Iran. And the other thing that I really want to touch on here is that they're really, really, really selling this nuclear threat. And then I think back to Iraq, and I've commented on this before. Iraq was going to buy yellow cake uranium. They were a huge threat. They had these weapons of mass destruction, mobile facilities. They had unmanned aerial vehicles to deliver weapons, maybe chemical weapons. And I remember all of the fear that was sold with the Iraq War. You would think that after that the American people would have would ask more questions. And right now, I don't see a lot of questions being asked. I see a lot of people buying the government's statement at face value. Maybe the people are more comfortable because they think that Democrats are not warlike like the Republicans. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. And as a matter of fact, we'll get into the differences between Democrats and Republicans here shortly, if there are any differences. But I heard a lot of these same arguments around Iraq. They justified going in, and at the time I supported that war, and I was on the wrong side of that, and it cost 4,400 people their lives. That's just American lives. That doesn't touch on the amount of Iraqi lives that were cost, and the other small coalition of the willing that was there as well. So there were some foreign soldiers, from other countries that decided to support us in our war. And so all of this fear was sold to us about Iraq. The same type of fear is being sold to us about Iran. And I think the worst thing we could do is to go into Iran, to start a war with Iran, because then we're going to turn some very pro-Western people against our country. And I don't want to see that happen. I think it weakens our national security to go into a country like that and to start a war. We're going to touch more on war here shortly. But moving right along, let's talk a little bit about Republicans and Democrats. There's this big illusion that the illusion is the two-party system itself. It creates an illusion that makes people think that they have control over these parties, and these parties are actually different, because we elect a Republican for 8 years in the Bush administration, and then we're angry at the Republicans, and we vote in President Obama and the Democrats, and he ran on a platform of change and ran a very excellent campaign. because it was an excellent manipulation of the American people. And don't get it wrong, it wouldn't matter if it was Barack Obama, if it was Bill Clinton, if it was Jimmy Carter, if it was Ronald Reagan, if it was George W. Bush. All of these politicians are the same. That's why you elect a Republican for 8 years and you're pissed at the end of that, and you say, let's get some change, let's vote in a Democrat. And then you vote in a Democrat, and what has changed? Did the wars end? No, they didn't. Did the bailouts end? The support of the international banking cartel? No. Did spending go down at all? I mean, George Bush was a fiscal conservative, took a surplus of cash, and then spent us into oblivion. And the only thing to make him look good in recent years is how much money Obama spent. So George Bush, the fiscal conservative, was not a fiscal conservative. He pissed money away like there was no tomorrow. And he created huge deficits. He expanded government in a huge way. I mean, the size of government almost expanded by a third under a guy that ran under a small government platform. Does this not tell you people that there is no difference between Republicans and Democrats? I really think that people need to start looking beyond the talking points of these people, of these politicians, and look at the meat of what they do. You know, back in 2008, ABC had did a program called Follow the Money. It was during the campaign season, and they went to the Democratic National Convention, and then they went to the Republican National Convention. And they sat outside these conventions, and they filmed the business leaders that were going in and the people that were donating money to these campaigns. And to a lot of people's surprise, the same exact people showed up, the same exact business people showed up to the Democratic National Convention that showed up to the Republican National Convention. And I remember a specific clip of an ABC guy getting muscled off of the sidewalk by a cop and being strong-armed and told he couldn't record. You know, and I had a lot of issue with that at the time. I mean, this guy's trying to record on public land. If it's a sidewalk in a public, right off of a public street, I don't care if it's outside a convention center. That sidewalk, our taxes went to pay for, and yet he was told that he couldn't record. And the reason, of course, they don't want him recording is because they don't want the American people to know that there's no difference between these two parties. That's the last thing they want you to do. The last thing they want you to do is to wake up and understand what's happening to your government or what's already happened. So, you know, and if you look right now at the contributors to Obama's campaign in 2008 and the people who are contributing to Mitt Romney's campaign now, and who are also going to contribute to Barack Obama's campaign. You've got Goldman Sachs, you've got Credit Suisse, you've got Citigroup, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley. This is a pay-for-play system, boys and girls. These people are covering their bets. It's the ultimate hedge. And the reason they pay both sides is because both sides represent their needs. Both sides are the same, have the same major goals. You know, one of the things that I always found interesting is I consider myself a student of history, and I'm really fascinated by the history of economics, because I think that in the history of economics is the greatest conspiracy in the history of the world is housed in that of the international banking cartel. And you know, if you look at how the Federal Reserve Act was passed, it was passed by a very clever manipulation. The Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913. And essentially what happened is anywhere the estimates are about 25 to 50% of the world's wealth gathered in an island off the coast of Georgia named Jekyll Island. My mother to this day lives probably about 15 miles from this island, so I've got to go out there and visit her and see firsthand this little piece of our very significant history that many people, I think, miss and have no idea. One of the things that they did when the Federal Reserve Act was written, the bankers sat down with political leaders on an island off the coast of Georgia, Jekyll Island, and they wrote up a law, the Federal Reserve Act, that essentially was a way to minimize competition, to ensure that if they ever incurred any losses, they would be pushed off on the American people. And they created a system of what I refer to as legalized corruption. And so once this was written, though, they had to convince the American people that this needed to be passed. And what they did is they created their own opposition. And you say, what do you mean they created their own opposition? Well, what they did is they got these big bankers to go out and to give interviews with all the different media outlets of the day, saying that this was going to be tragic for the American economy, this was going to be bad for the American people, this was going to be bad for business. And the people reading this thought, well, hey, if it's bad for bankers, then it must be good for America. And so they didn't oppose the bill, and so the bill naturally was passed. A very clever manipulation. So this is something that has been employed in the past where they create their own opposition to control the message, right? So they stood out there, the bankers who had actually written this bill and all supported it, saying that it was bad for business because this was a bit of reverse psychology. They knew how this would play on the common man in America at the time. This shouldn't be lost on people because this is a very common tactic that your government uses to manipulate you, okay? And I think that, I think ultimately that the Council of Foreign Relations may be one of these groups that's pulling the strings, and I think that they have created this two-party system so that they create their opposition. And by creating their opposition, they can control the message, okay? They pass along the illusion that there's two parties and you have a choice, right or left. But every time you have a choice, you seem pissed off at the end of that choice. That's the reality. And then we're going to kick that dirty Republican out and bring in that new Democrat. But then nothing changes, and at the end of that term you say, we're going to kick that damn Democrat out of office and we're going to get a Republican in, and he's going to change things, and he's going to, in the Republican case, their talking points, we're going to bring smaller government, we're going to bring accountability, we're going to be business friendly, and these are all talking points. If you want to look at some of the most important issues of these two parties, when it comes to foreign policy and their support for their support of our current foreign interventionist foreign policy, both parties agree. And the reason I say both parties agree is because I look at their actions. I don't care about their talking points. Barack Obama went off about the war in Iraq, yet he came into office and continued. He came into office and continued the support for the war in Afghanistan. He came into office and said, we're going to close down Gitmo. Did he close down Gitmo? No. So what changed between Barack Obama's policies and George Bush's policies? Let's look at support for the international banking cartel. The bailouts started under Bush, continued under Obama. Bailouts are nothing new, boys and girls. They've been going on for a long time. So they may have different talking points on the surface, but when you pull up the hood and you really look at their core beliefs, the biggest thing is their support of the same type of economic system, the support of the international banking cartel, their support of an interventionist foreign policy, There's a lot of people that stand to make a lot of money off of these type of things, from the bankers to the military-industrial complex, and then they certainly have their agents in the media as well that create media empires. And when it comes to the Council of Foreign Relations, you've got guys like George Soros, you've got guys like Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch owns one of the biggest media organizations in the world, and he's basically got a tube into your house every day to manipulate you. And what they don't want you to know is that you don't have a choice with two parties. It's the perfect system for them, because the core principles, the support of the economic system, the support of the foreign policy, is the same between these two parties. What you get caught up in is the distractions, the talking points of these parties, the illusion that they're actually different. They're no different, people. Maybe the one exception to this rule is Ron Paul, and we'll touch a little bit on that here shortly. So, Ron Paul. Let's talk a little bit about Ron Paul's success in the primaries. In Iowa, you had Ron Paul, who got third place, strong showing. There was only like seven or eight votes between Mitt Romney and the other guy there, Rick Santorum. So there was only like 7 or 8 votes. Ron Paul took third place in Iowa. Ron Paul took second place in New Hampshire. And boy, you'd never know this in the media. You'd never have any idea that Ron Paul has all this support. And they're concerned about Ron Paul because he has very dangerous ideas. One, he wants to end the international banking cartel's grip on American politics and their control over it. He wants to end the Federal Reserve. He believes in sound economics. He believes in the gold standard. And the bankers always wanted an elastic economy because they stand to make the most money off of it. And I'm in the future, I'm going to give specific episodes of the Libertarian Manifesto on the international banking cartel. And when I say that, people think I sound like a lunatic. It always makes me laugh, because if you look at economic history, it's very clear that this is a cartel. This is not some business owners that believe in the free market. If you just look at the Federal Reserve is not federal, nor is it a reserve. It's not government owned. It's owned by private banks. It's not a reserve. A reserve implies that we have something of intrinsic value that backs up the paper that's sitting in your pocket. There is nothing of intrinsic value. There is no gold standard. The last tiny fractional gold standard that we had was removed by President Nixon. Okay? So these type of things are very dangerous ideas. They're anti-establishment, and the media downplays the success of a guy like Ron Paul because they are controlled by these corporate giants. And Rupert Murdoch, by the way, sits on the Council of Foreign Relations. So that'll be an interesting subject later. We'll get into Rupert Murdoch, and we'll talk specifically about Fox News, one of my favorite targets. Don't get it wrong, I don't watch the Democrat channel either, but the Republican channel really, really irritates the hell out of me. The Democrat channel being MSNBC. Neither one of them are really looking out for the best interest of the American people. Neither one of them are asking intelligent questions, and neither one of them are actually news organizations. They're more cheerleaders for the establishment. And I'll probably do some episodes on the media itself later. But so Ron Paul's against the Fed. Ron Paul wants to end foreign aid. Ron Paul wants to bring our soldiers home to protect our sovereign nation. And Ron Paul's against war. These things make him a very dangerous man. And when you see the media portrayal of him, it's as if he's a joke. It's as if his ideas are absurd. Well, if you believe that, and I think a lot of people do think, oh, this guy Ron Paul, he's a kook. Well, if you believe that, I suggest you read about the Founding Fathers. Guys like Thomas Jefferson, I don't think I've ever seen anything in my lifetime that is close to a Thomas Jefferson type of politician in politics as far as his ideals of liberty and what they mean. I strongly suggest that you read. There's a book I read, The Freedom Under Siege by Ron Paul. And not just Ron Paul, but he's got a lot of good ideas about foreign policy and of liberty and what liberty really means. You look at President Obama, for instance, and you wouldn't think that he would sign things like the Defense Authorization Act, which gives the government the right to indefinitely imprison American citizens without trial. And these things are direct violations of the Constitution. And this isn't an attack Obama thing, but I do think that Obama should be held to a higher standard because of the fact that he's a constitutional scholar. I mean, this guy was a college professor, for God's sakes. And he's got one of the best educations that you can get in this country. He knows that things like this are a violation of the Constitution. It's just like when Bush signed the Patriot Act. Now, granted, Bush was a moron. He was nowhere near as educated as President Obama. But at the same time, he was smart enough to know that these things are violations of the Constitution. So if you've got Republicans violating the Constitution, you've got Democrats violating the Constitution, you've got Republicans supporting war overseas, you've got Democrats supporting war overseas, you've got Republicans that spend ungodly amounts of money when they're in office and run up the deficit, and you've got Democrats that do the same thing. You tell me, what is the difference between these two parties? And when you find it, please let me know. Anyways, this has been episode 1 of the Libertarian Manifesto. Please check out my website, IHateRepublicrats.com. That's www.IHateRepublicrats.com. Check me out on Facebook at Facebook.com/IHateRepublicrats. And follow me on Twitter at the letter H, the number 8, POLITRIX. I Hate Politics. So check me out on Facebook, check out my website, post some comments on some of my blogs, and do your best to educate your fellow American citizen. It's time us in the alternative media really get our message out to wake Americans up to the reality of what's going on around them. You're not going to find the truth on Fox News. You're not going to find the truth on MSNBC. So check out my site, check out other sites, read, open your eyes, and educate yourself. This is the Libertarian Manifesto, signing off.